Hey everyone, it's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Greetings from upstate New York. I'm up in the Catskills sheltering with my family. I hope you all are doing well on this wonderful, hot, and depending upon where you are in the country, broiling hot summer day. Hopefully you're inside taking advantage of the next hour that we're going to have together. We're going to be joined by our friends from Elevate Energy as well as Public Narrative. They're all out based in Chicago, where it's probably a little bit steamy, but we'll hear that from them in a quick minute. We have a full room, so a lot of folks joining us for today's conversation. But let me just yak at you for a minute. And as I do so, we got a request from our friend Sylvia, which happens to be one of my favorite tunes. Little Sly and the Family Stone as we get started. If this is too loud, I'm sure y'all let me know in the chat. But as we always do, if you've been with us before for a network webinar, please go ahead and take your finger or your mouse, whatever you use to manipulate your computer, go down into you should see a bar pop up there. It's a chat function. And go ahead and make sure it's set for all panelists and attendees so that we're talking to each other. Because not only is this a network webinar, but we also want to make sure we're in community. Hey, Keith, how are you? Greetings from Atlanta, or probably especially hot Atlanta right about now. What we typically ask you all to do is, as you're setting in, is give us your name, where you're coming in from, and then an idea that we borrowed from Professor Brene Brown down at the University of Houston, and that is the 2-word check-in. So just 2 quick words. How are you doing right now? So go ahead and start adding those in, and I'll just say hello myself in here. See if I can type. Can't type very well. Hi, it's Sean. And Vita, how are you? Others, if you would, go ahead in there. Make sure you're talking to all panelists and attendees. Lisa, how are you? Not bad. Amy, how are you doing? In Connecticut, overwhelmed and inspired. Yeah, these polarities, we're all experiencing these sort of emotions that ought to be at odds with one another, but they're both present. Doing well, Isaac. Glad to see that. Hey, Cedric, how are you? Daniel, how are you? Sharon. All right, y'all are going way too fast for me now, as it always seems to happen, but keep in conversation with one another. Our friend Kareem Alston is going to be in here in the chat. He's going to be sharing links as those things come up in the course of our conversation. He is also going to be taking live notes. We'll have a Google Doc to share with all of you. And along that line of making notes, our colleague Yab Sarah Ferris, who's sheltering down in Washington, D.C. Yabby is making notes on Twitter. So if you want to manage 2 screens at the same time, you can do that. The hashtag that she's organizing us under is ComNetLive. That's ComNetLive. Hey, everybody. Look at all these folks from all over the place. Letitia in Brazil. Oh my goodness. You guys trying to stay positive. Y'all are going through a lot. Actually, I know a lot of you are. Our colleague Tristan, who's running the slide deck, is down in Florida. And of course, cases just exploding with COVID-19 there. So hoping and glad to know most of you are safe and well, hoping that's true for everybody in your orbit. If we could, Mr. T, let's go ahead and take it forward. A couple quick things, a little bit of housekeeping I want to share with you. So you probably know this, but if you don't, the network, in addition to these webinars and this year, our first ever virtual gathering, which we're going to talk about in a second, we have these local groups in 17 cities around the country. 2 of them are going to be gathering very, very soon, and they're all gathering virtually right now, which of course makes sense given the conditions we find ourselves in. In Washington, D.C., we're going to have another conversation about equity led by the D.C. local group. You can find out more about that, and I'm sure Kareem will put the link in here in just a quick second. Tamara Copeland, who is a leader of the Washington Regional Grantmakers Group, is going to be with us. She wrote a fantastic, really important piece in the Chronicle of Philanthropy just a couple of months back. She will be there as part of a conversation thinking about equity in the Washington region. And then I believe next week, next Thursday, our good friend, Dr. Clarence B. Jones, who helped to write the Dream Speech with Martin Luther King back in the early 1960s, 1963. He's going to be joining our friends from Com Network Seattle for a Seattle-focused conversation. So more on all of that soon. You can get more through that link that Kareem just put in. All right, Mr. T, if you'll take us forward. Other thing we want to flag for you, chances are you all know this. We published a survey and many of you participated. So thank you to those of you who did take the time to do that. But that survey has now been published. It's available. We're going to do a webinar sharing what we learned with y'all next Tuesday. So keep an eye on your inbox that you can learn a little bit more. Our friends from Atlantic 57 who help to administer and analyze all the findings will be with us to share what they learned and some of the steps ahead for all of us working in the field. Mr. T, if you would, go ahead, take us forward. This is the other thing. Hopefully all you know about this by now. The network is going to gather. ComNet 20, we'd all planned to gather in Atlanta. Unfortunately, we've had to cancel that for all the obvious reasons. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't still make a point of gathering. Our values demand it. Our purpose demands it of us. So we're going to. End of September, we'll be gathering in a 3-day span for something we're going to call V. Nicole Hannah-Jones, Dr. Richard Besser, who else? Joy Harjo, Renee DeResta, Alexis McGill-Johnson, a number of other folks will join us for that. And then in addition to that 3-day sort of learning event, we're also going to do this thing we're calling V+. You'll see that there on the screen. V+ is more of an extended sort of exclusive experience that's going to run say mid-September into the end of November, early December. And the idea there is really being in community with your other colleagues and peers. We're going to put you into small groups of folks, perhaps not more than 10, to experience V, but also to have some special learning experiences that'll happen in October and November, so that we're all in community with one another, at least those who choose to do this, as the elections unfold before us and we all start going into that planning mode of thinking ahead to 2021. It's been a heck of a year. We think it's a really, really valuable, cool opportunity. So you can learn more about that all through a link that Kareem just put up into the chat. All right, Mr. T, last slide, I think, for me. This is one I'm super duper excited about. You all are going to get a message about this in your inbox probably in the next hour or two, and that is circles. Maybe you already know what this is. If we already have locals, and for many, many years we've had ComNet, this year V, the last piece of sort of the network's means of gathering folks who work in our field is this new program that we just launched a couple months ago. It's called Circles, and the idea is pretty simple. At least initially, our thought was, let's gather people based on the role or the job function that you have within your organization. So let's say you're running a department, maybe it's helpful to you to talk to other people who have that kind of responsibility. Or you're working on a specific issue area or topic. We want to put you in conversation with other folks. Maybe you're working on ocean conservation. Helps to hear how other organizations are thinking about that issue, how they're attacking it. Maybe they can share things that they're learning along the way. So that's the conceit behind Circles. But today, thanks to our friend Jenny Oldham, we are also going to announce a brand new circle that is focused on Black communications professionals. So we're going to start thinking about identity as another way to gather folks. And this initial one will be focused on folks working in the social sector who identify as African American or Black. And then you can imagine in time, perhaps we'll have opportunities for folks who identify as LGBTQ or Latinx or any number of other shared identities. And so more about that in your inbox in very, very short order. It will be free this year. Eventually, we think we're probably going to charge you all to help participate in this, and to underwrite it. But for now, we're going to make it free, and we know it's urgent. So I think for this one, as with all of them, it's first come, first serve. So if you're interested, keep an eye on your inbox. And Carrie just put in a link for that just now, so you can learn a little bit more. But stay abreast of your inbox, because we're going to share that opportunity very, very soon. All right, I think that's the last slide I have to do. I do. Okay, cool. Thank you, Mr. T. So now I get to pass it over to my good friend and someone I admire deeply. She's been with us. She was with us in ComNet in Austin just a couple of months ago now, or coming on a year, I guess. But Jamira is going to take us through the beginning of this conversation. She's the leader of public narrative out in Chicago. You can see Jamira's slide along with everybody else joining us just now. Why don't I stop yakking and sit back and enjoy yourselves, folks. We're all available in the chat. We'll have those notes as I promised, and you can also, again, follow on Twitter with ComNet Live. Jamira, off to you, my friend.
Thank you so much, Sean. So I have the esteemed pleasure of presenting among my dear colleagues and friends at Elevate Energy who introduced me to ComNet. So I'm, really excited about being connected to this audience. We have here Ann Evans, who is the CEO of Elevate Energy, as well as the Director of Strategic Communications, and a dear mentor of mine, Ms. Sylvia Ewing, and of course, Yami Newell, who oversees the community projects for Elevate Energy. So at this time, we're going to talk about why exactly we're gathering. Sylvia?
Thank you. Next slide, please. So thrilled to be here. I'm a huge fan of ComNet, so I'm geeking out in so many ways. Fan of Circles, a lot of thought went into that. But why are we gathering? We're here to share what we know, who gets it right, and how to pass the mic. This isn't like those movies when the meteor was coming or Godzilla, and we could count on leadership in Washington and others to save us. We're the people that we've been waiting for. And we want to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind, and we use this opportunity to rebuild better. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass it back to Jamira to talk about just that, how to reach everyone that we need to speak to. Jamira?
Thank you, Sylvia. And so next slide, please. When we think about what we know, particularly about the communities hit hardest at this time and most disconnected from the broader discussion, typically it is your members of the Black and Latinx communities. And when you think about why that is, as we follow the conversations in the various discussion threads, it all roots back to systemic or structural racism. And so when thinking about, what COVID-19 really opened up for us in understanding how resources are in most cases allocated, but sometimes they miss the mark as far as really, landing in communities, being able to impact communities for the betterment of youth and families, that's exactly where we need to really focus our efforts at this point in time. The broader discussion involving members of the Black and Latinx communities has a series of activities involved in that whole process. So we're going to dig deeper into that throughout the presentation. But Yami is going to share with us particularly around how the impact of the disconnection within those conversations, how that impacts the Black and Latinx communities. Yami?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jamira. My name is Yami. I'm with Elevate Energy, and I'm really glad to be here to join the discussion today. I work with a team of individuals who are actively engaged in community outreach throughout the state of Illinois, and they're talking to folks in every corner of this vast state, from metropolitan centers to suburban areas, rural communities. There are a lot of folks and niches within these groups that are being impacted by a global pandemic, which is bringing to the surface a lot of the structural racism that has existed as a part of the history of this country for quite some time, as well as we're in the middle of a huge civil rights movement accompanied by civil unrest. People are extremely frustrated, but in this moment, their most basic needs are at risk. Employment, so financial stability, uncertainty around the future for their children and education, sending their children back to school, public health and safety, high risk jobs that they're having to take on in order to make ends meet, and the end of unemployment benefits that are going to be wrapping up for so many people. We've seen minority communities hit the hardest throughout this. In every type of communities where we exist. And as part of environmental justice and restoration, we're committed to listening to those stories, gathering those stories, and making sure that they inform how we prepare for how to build better and move towards a brighter future. Thank you, Jamira.
Absolutely. So when we think about, next slide, please, Tristan. When we think about communicating with those communities that are hit hardest, beautiful thing here in Chicago, there were tons of memes that were surfacing around COVID-19 about our mayor, and it really kind of brought some lightheartedness to the experience of shifting and adjusting and pivoting. And the beautiful thing about the messages that were going out initially, unbeknownst to Mayor Lightfoot's team, they really began to lean into it, even as more memes began to surface. And so you see two memes here on the screen that reach two completely different audiences. One audience greater than the other, but both needing to hear and understand the message of stay home, save lives. And so Mayor Lightfoot and her team did a fantastic job and are still doing a fantastic job in communicating how important it is to follow this reopening Illinois plan, and then keeping us updated, through Facebook, Facebook Lives and different information that is put out. And so as this information is being translated, it's translated culturally, but it's translated particularly for the audiences in which Chicagoans represent. So we have more urban audiences represented. We have other audiences represented that, take to the arts and different things. And so just in being conscious of who we're speaking to, when we, as communicators, when we think about the messages that we're sending, we have to be very intentional about how we communicate that message. It may be all nice and neat for us and just great and polished for us. But when it comes to our audience, it's so important to make certain that it's in a language that they can understand. Next slide, please. So in the midst of COVID-19, of course, there is now this civil unrest as we, are still even mourning the loss of George Floyd, mourning the murder of George Floyd, seeking justice for Breonna Taylor. And in doing so, there's a lot that's happening all at one time. COVID-19 brought upon us as Americans, it brought upon this this fear, this dread, this constant state of unknowing, really not knowing where to pivot, where to shift, where to turn. And so as the pressure continues to mount, there's this constant, threat of what does tomorrow look like? What does next week look like? Will our businesses remain? Will our organizations stay intact? What do we do when it comes to serving the community that we work with? And how do we even instruct our staff? How do we lead our teams? And so this global outrage has really evolved into a push for real reform. And that's where we as communicators within our organizations can really lean in and listen to the voices of the community to understand how are we indeed communicating our message, being very intentional around what we do, but also being sensitive to the time. It's very important to put out a statement and to put out, guidance for how we should navigate, this particular time, but a statement is nothing without action to support it. So I would go so far as to suggest that you look at how you're going to support communities that you serve. How are you going to follow through on your mission? How are you going to deliver your values, deliver, your objectives? How are you going to do that? And then wrap that up in this nice bow of a statement that suggests this is why you should remain connected to us as an organization. And these are the ways in which we're going to communicate. Now, you don't necessarily have to, advise that particularly, like watch for our blog or watch for our newsletter. You don't necessarily have to communicate that, but just in being intentional and consistent in delivering those materials, that ultimately communicates that. And so as we look continuously at the protests, the people stepping up in creative and thoughtful ways, it's really causing our world to really shift and turn in a way that allows us to see that we're going to constantly, throughout this entire year, go through a series of pivots. But as that happens, how are we communicating that? How intentional are we around listening to our audiences, listening to our teams that we work with in order to be able to, provide some solutions and innovation around what's happening? We have to really lean into the resilience of the Black community. I think that is one of the things that we are really able to draw on from the past and really draw on from history. But beyond that, as Americans, we really have to, kind of band together and understand and empathize with one another. So as an organization, how are you able to do that through and by what we know about this very trying time? Yami, you want to add anything?
Absolutely, Jameer. I really couldn't agree with that sentiment more. And to dive a little deeper, that's the first thing that we did as a team, is to go back to the communities that we serve and really embark on a listening campaign. We started with listening. We started with opening up the space to create room for stories that were from people who have been speaking, right? But that we haven't made the space for. And in doing so, we found very creative solutions to some of the barriers that we're encountering in this new environment, right? We have traditionally been used to providing in-person outreach in the form of workshops and meetings, but we can't do that. We're socially or physically distant, but we've had to maintain a level of social connectedness. And that comes from managing our relationships in a way that starts with active listening. And so through that, we've come up with some very creative solutions. For example, how do you engage seniors in an environment that has become completely wireless? For folks who are not comfortable going online, how do you speak to them? And so one of the ways that we've been doing that has really been leaning into the organizational and community partnerships that we've been able to forge up to this point, who've been in contact with their constituents via telephone. And we came up with a very creative idea to offer, energy bingo as a way to bring some fun and creativity. But that comes from listening to our partners about what's important to the people on the ground that we intend to serve. So thanks for bringing that up.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Yami. Next slide, please. To that sentiment of listening, we learned a lot from the philanthropic communities here in Chicago to understand how exactly do we pivot, how do we make this shift? And, kudos to the Chicago Community Trust, the Chicago Foundation for Women, the Field Foundation, as well as the Polk Brothers Foundation, and of course the McCormick Foundations. They've rallied together, in addition to others, to really identify the needs of the Chicago community among their grantees and even organizations not necessarily supported by their foundations. And so one of the things that is really paramount for all of us is to get educated around what's happening and where we can be of support. What is missing? What's not, presently there? What doesn't presently exist? And how can we as an organization really tap into that? I think that is one of the most key things to really identify when you think about your pivot. As communicators, certainly we want to learn it, we want to understand it, and perhaps even introduce new language, but understand that simply by acknowledging where we are as a country goes very far with audiences, because it indicates you see me. You understand me, you understand my pain, you understand the trouble that I'm having. And so I'm really grateful for the foundations and the philanthropic community, because there were a series of surveys that I'm sure all of you all have received for them to really gauge the need of the community and how they can be of support and rally resources. I think that took a lot of the edge off and really kind of figuring out where do we go from here, because they were able to offer that guidance. When we think about, the change of policies and practice, as well as becoming an advocate, I think as leaders, and I'm sure Ann might agree with this, as leaders, it's very important for us to identify the influence that we have and how we can leverage that. This is not a time for us to stay silent, either let your action or your words speak, but in any event, they have to go together hand in hand. And so I'll hand it to Ann real quick to just add, more sentiment to this around how racial equity needs to continue to be, top of mind in this moment as we continue to rebuild. Ann?
Thank you, Jamira. And next slide, Tristan. Thank you. So I'm going to start with a fact and lead to a call to action. In recent polling, independent sector is telling us that nonprofits and foundations are hugely respected and trusted. And so with that piece of information, leads to the call to action. As leaders, as myself as a leader of our organization, but as all of us are leaders, it's up to us to take advantage of the door, the little sliver of a door that is opened by the pandemic and the movement. So this point in time is just so important, and it's up to us to not only walk through that door with solutions that really advance racial equity, push through that door, slide through that door, dance through that door, however you get through that door, we need to take this action now together. At Elevate, we work to advance racial equity through climate action. That means we generate clean jobs, we save money for people on utility bills. So we are sliding through the doorway that is opened right now and really advocating hard for fair utility practices moving forward at a time when sheltering in place is just so important, and having your utilities working is just so important to all of us. Next slide. I'm going to start by saying thank you to the foundations who are getting it right, and share with you my experience of what it has meant to be a leader and how foundations are getting it right. What we experienced is immediate reach out by most of our foundations who wanted to know and learn what we were experiencing on the ground and what our communities, the communities that we serve, were experiencing on the ground. We were offered immediate flexibility on reporting, on shifting funds around, even shifting project funds to general operating funds, which is, in my experience, hugely unprecedented. So we're really grateful to folks that allowed us to do that. And what that support from the foundations did for us is allowed us to pivot. So I want to say thank you to all our foundation friends, and in particular, give a shout out to our friends at the JPB Foundation that allowed us to do a huge pivot, next slide, and provide direct relief to people who needed it right away. So I'll give you an example, and this builds on what Yami was saying, is we reached out immediately to our seniors who we've been working with to upgrade their homes and control their utility costs. And we heard right away in March that people needed emergency groceries. This is, of course, at a time when our nation's food distribution systems were really reeling from the just huge demand that was required. And so the flexibility that our foundation partners provided us allowed us to step up and get groceries delivered to seniors on Chicago's South and West Side immediately, starting in the second, third week of March. That's one example. We also pivoted with our affordable housing partners to provide rental assistance, and that is ongoing. And I think one of the even more important, it's all important. I don't mean to say more important. It's all important. We were able to make sure that our minority contractors who tried like many to take advantage of the federal programs like the payroll protection program and really struggled to get to the front of the line in order to get those relief payments. We were able to provide technical assistance, hand-holding, phone calling, advocating to make sure that those grant programs were made available to everybody and that the benefits really got to the folks that needed it most. Next slide, Tristan. So I want to take a moment also to do a shout out to some of our partners in the business community who are getting it right, Ben & Jerry's, and also to our electeds. As you all can tell, we love our Mayor Lightfoot and the beauty, eloquence, and humor that she brings to telling the very tough messages of what it means to stay home and stay safe. I also want to thank Governor J.B. Pritzker for making Illinois a safer place. And then I have to personally give a shout out to Governor Cuomo, who he may not know this, but he became my personal therapist as I watched him every day. And I love his rebranding and his branding of New York Forward. And we have no good idea can't be used again, I always say. And so we're thrilled to rebrand our Rebuilding Together as Elevate Forward, because we don't want to go back, right? Back wasn't working. We all know that. We need to go forward. And I think at this time, as Jumeirah was saying, it's great to put out statements, and that's wonderful. But what the real work is unearthing the values, beliefs, systems that support racism and white supremacy, unearthing them so that we can do the hard work of unlearning those systems, those beliefs, and dismantling them so that we can really move forward better together. We've done that work at Elevate, and I think it's important that we're both doing that work externally, but we're also listening to our own team and their own experiences. So I invite you, I encourage you to do that work together with us. Next slide. And then I want to always thank Sean for reminding me that as CEO, I am also the communicator in chief. And that means both for our external audiences as well as our internal audiences, our own team. And I've got a few points here on the slide that help me to stay authentic in my voice and stay true to it and be clear, concise, and action-oriented. And I'm gonna leave you with one last guide, which is do not stay in your lane. Now is a time that we all have to lift up our voices and move forward together better. And with that, I'm happy to toss it back to Sylvia. Next slide. Sylvia's on mute.
Oh, Sylvia's in communications. Okay, thank you very much. I'm so excited by everything that I've heard going before us. And I want to point out that picture of people lifting cases of water also included our CEO. Everybody doesn't have to do it, but when we talk about getting your hands in on the work, Anne definitely does that. This is an international issue. This is one of the slides before had said it was the greatest opportunity since Reconstruction. It really is that door for us to move forward and rebuild better. And on the international front, I want to thank Debra Benjamin, another person I met at ComNet. You know how we all love ComNet. I met her in Austin. She's from the St. Croix Women's Foundation. And we've just stayed in touch after presenting a workshop at the gathering about Black women magic and making space for other voices. So she shared with me the story of Deanna James, who, when she moved into leadership, saw the differences in how she was met as the head of the St. Croix Foundation as a Black woman versus the previous leader who was white. And she found a way to gather all foundations together in diversity to center on race and equity and to come up with ways to meet and connect together. This, I think, is an offshoot of that. She is one of 60 foundation executives who put out a statement requesting action by philanthropy on anti-Black racism, getting right to the heart of what Ann had said. And I won't read point by point, but I think it's really important for you to look at this slide with an eye to what you can do within your organization. And hi, Debra Benjamin, I just saw you in the chat. Okay, I'm not gonna get distracted, but it's happening worldwide. And so increase investments in Black-led organizations. That includes media organizations, that includes cultural organizations, that includes your vendors. And push structural change with your endowments. Of course, prioritize spending on the most vulnerable communities. Next slide, Tristan. Encourage shared responsibility in your investments, and understand that Black leaders and communities have to be involved in the development of short and long-term options. I always say to my team, we want to take advantage of the opportunity in the moment, and we want to always see the long game. Trustee accountability, whatever your organization might be, whether you're a foundation, a nonprofit, even some of the consulting organizations, take stock of what you're doing with your trustees and engage Black businesses in investment. I think that those are all really key things that we can each do as we look at this global situation, this global moment. I've heard from friends from Dubai and London to South Africa. We're all standing together, understanding that the structural racism and institutional issues that have been allowed to exist and that America represents so deeply because of our history of slavery matter. So I'll go on to the next slide. Making sure that you also focus on gender and reaching out to the diaspora. And I don't want to miss the disparities in prison. We got a lot of shout outs from Chicago. Love you guys. I spent some time working on the re-election of a progressive running for Cook County State's attorney. And I learned just how this message from St. Croix resonates in Chicago and around the world. Right now, we have people experiencing COVID-19 in prisons. These are folks who are going to return to the same zip codes, the same communities that are already under stress. These are also folks who have family members and people who love them who can't be their best selves and look out for all the things that they need to do during this time of crisis because of the terrible situation that their loved ones are in. So this matters to everyone. Next slide. So in the next section, as we're rounding the end, and Sean may jump in with a question because we're doing pretty decent on time, but I'm going to talk about passing the mic and community building. I'm going to talk about strengthening and encouraging new voices. Jamira is going to come back and talk about creating safe spaces for active listening. She is a relatively new president of a very old organization that honors Studs Terkel and that Chicago storytelling, elevating stories tradition. We also love the yes and of improv. So she's going to give you some great tips. And then Yami is going to give you her expertise around collecting community stories. Next slide. So in strengthening and encouraging voices, I tried to organize this into context, door openers versus gatekeepers. You can quote me on that, and being intentional. So context, the ComNet listserv is really a great place to turn for that. Someone can tell you how to find it, but there you can lift other voices by responding to people who are looking for stories, who are looking for resources, who are looking in this moment for people who can bring diversity and lived experience into their work. You'll find brilliance, and you'll also find people who are just as confused and worried as you are. I also want to talk about how you can piggyback on your stories and pass the mic in a very concrete way. Elevate was asked by some writers for Forbes to talk about our work and to talk about equity in how we center equity in clean jobs and things like that. And we use that moment to say, you should talk to the filmmakers behind Cooked, Survival by Zip Code, the same people in the same zip codes who experienced the Chicago heat wave, which was the anniversary of it was this week, as a matter of fact, are the same people who are always facing the pandemic, the climate change, et cetera. And they were happy to expand the story to include our friends from Cooked. And then we had, for our anniversary, had planned to elevate other voices, because that's how we like to roll. But we created a podcast series with what we call climate pathfinders or change makers. And they come from social justice communities. And it just turned out that we might have only been on our second podcast, but everyone that was speaking and who we had passed the mic to had something incredibly relevant to say for this moment. And those are the kinds of things that you can do, new platforms, new ways to pass the mic. Door opener, not a gatekeeper. When I was in media, there were so many gatekeepers. You can't get on this show or do that until you got past the gatekeeper. You see it in the philanthropic world. Be a door opener. And when you are, and when you're making your statements, I think Yami and Jamira touched on this, be real and authentic. Many of you may have heard about the changes for our friends at the Poetry Foundation. Great staff doing great work, but they put out a statement when we were all on the ComNet listserv trying to get our statements right. They put out a statement that was not well received, not by the world, but by the people who worked with them closely. And it led to a deep interrogation of their practices and policies, and a change in leadership in their board and in the head of the organization. I still count on them to do great work going forward, but it's a cautionary tale about the changes that can come, because there are calls for equity everywhere, from the theater to science and technology to even the CDC. And when we hear those calls, it's important for those of us who have walked this journey for a long time to meet people where they are. They're not gonna suddenly get it. It's going to take patience and kindness to move them along, knowing that there are a lot of people who don't have that in a large supply, but try to meet people where they are. Lastly, be intentional. On the ComNet listserv, there's some polling that we look at, and referenced other polling earlier. Find out where people are as you're passing the mic and building communities. If people are deeply focused on the economy, they might not want to hear about your other future thing. If they're deeply focused on the fear of health and the growing outbreaks, calibrate your message, not in a pandering way, but in an understanding way to meet them where they are, and count what matters. How many stories did you do for a certain community? What are your metrics around your work and where you're centering race? If you don't count it, it won't happen. And finally, make partnerships possible. Everywhere you can, be a connector. And sometimes the people who were just awful a year ago have had a moment where it might be your chance to chat with them. So that's enough for me. Let's go to the next on our passing the mic, and that's Jamira. Jamira?
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you for making mention of that. I've been at Public Narrative for 18 months now, and that's exactly how I came to know Sylvia Ewing. My predecessor, Susie Schultz, introduced me to Sylvia in like making our rounds and really like understanding the history of the organization. And Sylvia was just that, not a gatekeeper, but a door opener. And in doing so, of course, as I said earlier, being connected to this great network. In the time I've spent at Public Narrative, formerly Community Media Workshop, I had to learn the history of the organization, and it forced me to really settle myself and hold off on implementing so many ideas, but to understand how the implementation of this strategy or this idea, what impact might that have on our existing community. And so I'm saying that to say that it's since become a practice of the organization under my leadership. But I think COVID-19 is no different in that understanding that whatever it is that you introduce, you have to understand how that's going to impact your community. You don't want to lose anyone. You don't want to, ostracize or isolate anyone by your messages. You want to be very intentional with your messages. And so starting right at home with the Black, Indigenous, and people of color on your team, listening to them for feedback. They understand your mission, your vision, your values. They understand your strategic goals. They understand how you do your work. They understand how communities respond. And so you have to take that expertise for exactly what it is. It's really gold for you. And so when you listen to those audiences that you have within your own teams, within your own environment, I think it's important to know that some of those conversations may be courageous. It requires a lot of empathy, a lot of patience with one another. But in any event, being very clear around what the goals are for that discussion and that we're looking to accomplish these sets of goals, and this is how we're hoping to accomplish that. Setting some norms, if norms don't already exist, for open and active listening among your teams, that you can have honest dialogue with your team, your leadership team, your staff members, other members of the team, whomever it is that whoever is having a direct impact or direct contact with your external community, those are the folks you want to bring in, even if it's your board of directors. You want to make certain that the communication is solid, is strong, but most of all is cohesive. Beyond that, of course, you want to welcome feedback from the community that you serve. You have to listen to those stories and those voices. And again, it may come with some courageous conversations. One of the things that we did at Public Narrative that Elevate was, of course, a supporter of, we initiated this series, Uplifting Voices, where we brought in different folks from different backgrounds to talk about the impact of COVID-19. And since we've talked about COVID-19 and democracy, we've talked about, what it's like to be a member of the disabled community in a time of COVID-19 and civil unrest. And just in listening to those stories, we're allowing those stories to inform our next steps. And so right now, ultimately, we're focusing on how do we actually change the narrative and not just say that we're changing the narrative, but how do we invite all these voices to the table to be a part of that process? It first starts for us in that active listening piece. And then ultimately, really leveraging the feedback that you get from both groups. Those are two groups who interface often, sometimes unbeknownst to us as leaders. And so we want to be very respectful of what's going on, even beyond our purview. We don't have all the answers. We don't have all the ideas and concepts. But for the ideas and the concepts that we do have, certainly the golden nuggets that come to us in the shower and on our way around as we're driving and things, you don't want to marry those ideas. They may be great ideas to introduce to your team, but let them be just that. Let them be that foundation that your team can build on. When you give people ownership and a sense of community, that you value their voice, their input, and their strategies, it allows them to take ownership in what the organization is doing, that you get a chance to celebrate those wins together. And so in communicating that, you know, on your, be it newsletters, social media, developing different campaigns, that you can also invite your online community to be a part of that listening session, or that those providing solutions and ideas for innovation. But in the end, you want to be very careful to be clear on what the end goal is and how you're going to get there. You want to get there, you want to be around for the long haul and not just for a short distance. In rebuilding better, we have to think about how we're going to take all of those stories, leverage those stories, invite more stories, but give people a space to make them feel and know that their voices matter and that we hear them. And Yami can talk more about how Elevate is taking that same approach.
Thank you, Jamira. Next slide, please, Tristan. Thank you so much. I think this is a perfect segue into some of the work that we've been doing that I'd like to highlight. As I mentioned earlier, back in March, when the shelter-in-place order went into effect here in Illinois, my team engaged on what I would call an active listening campaign. We knew that our environment has suddenly shifted, right? We were no longer able to meet with people in person. So much of the work that we do is relationship driven. It's that person-to-person human contact that allows us to really bond and learn about the communities that we're entering and the people that we're talking to. And suddenly we didn't have that as an option. And so as we listened, right, we're listening to survey the needs of the folks throughout Illinois, because again, our state is comprised, as many of you, where you live, your states are comprised of different groups and urban centers, rural, suburban areas, different ethnic groups, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, et cetera. And so how do you survey the needs of all of these people and then combine them into something meaningful? And that's what our team started to do. We started the work, and it's hard work. It's really the grassroots work that it's gonna make the difference in how we transcend and build better out of this opportunity. Challenge is a new opportunity for changes, and that's where we are. That's what this moment brings to light for so many of us. And so our first goal was to listen, and how did we do that, right? We spent hours on the phone, sending emails. We utilized social media. We really just utilized the platform and the outreach mechanisms that didn't require in-person connection. And what that meant is that we did a lot of listening, and we heard a lot from people about the challenges that they're facing, from employment to uncertainty about the future, what that means for their families, what that means for their communities, what that means for, you know, their lives essentially going forward. And certainly there was a lot of challenge reflected in that, but one of the key takeaways for us was that there was a tremendous amount of resilience built into the fabric of the communities, of the people from the communities that we spoke to and that we heard. No one had given up. People were banding together and working collaboratively in ways that we hadn't even imagined initially. It did take time to readjust, and that was okay. But the conversations and the kinds of work and the kinds of community building that we saw as a result of that, those are the kinds of stories that we believe need to be amplified, and we need to make space for those as well. Those are the kinds of stories that we've seen lead to some of the amazing creative solutions that we found in the communities as we began our listening campaign. Meeting people where they are. Again, whether you're dealing with seniors or young people, right? You have to find where are people located. And just because you know where that is doesn't mean that you'll be invited to share that space. And that's why that grassroots work of relationship building is so important. If you want to get an invite to the cookout, if you will, if I could throw in that colloquial reference, the best way to do that is to be able to have staff or folks from those communities working with or within your organizations. That's a wonderful way to have access to those communities and to be a part of the conversations and dialogues, to be able to collect those stories authentically. But also, if you don't have that opportunity, just being open, right? Being open to people sharing their narratives and listening. Here in the city of Chicago, if you turn on the nightly news, you might be warned about all of, what is perceived to be only violence that exists here. But in the work that I do from the south side of Chicago to the west side of Chicago, what I see is people who have the same dreams and visions as everybody else. I see a tremendous amount of community organizing and building. I see phenomenal creative solutions to problems that are happening on the ground at the community level, but those stories are not amplified, and it's time to make space and room to start to amplify those stories and talk to those communities and allow them to identify their needs and drive forward what is going to be helpful and what is going to lead to brighter futures for them and their families. In highlighting that resilience, I think that we are able to build on a new pathway, right? Where we oftentimes, as Sylvia touched on, using powerful language, right, to describe the community, asset-based language, to describe the strengths and the resilience that these communities have. It creates a new space for creative learning about how can we engage and how do communities inform their own movement forward to be better and build better in this moment. That's going to look different. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. There needs to be the flexibility from a funding standpoint with regards to nuance. There needs to be investment in that grassroots education so that we can find out what that nuance entails, community by community, person by person, relationship by relationship, neighbor to neighbor. And that's how we're going to roll up our sleeves and get through the difficult work that's going to propel us forward and move us in a better direction for the future. So thank you so much for having us. I look forward to some great questions, and I'm going to turn this back over to Sylvia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yami. I'm so motivated and thrilled to be with you all. And I'm so proud to, again, say we are the most American of cities, Chicago. So don't believe the hype, because we're here getting it all together. So on to the next slide, please. Some of our last thoughts. We talked about bringing more decision-making power to the community level, and yet another place where Chicago has led the nation is in restorative justice. It absolutely works. Think about it at the level of your work internally, the peace circle and things like that, and think about it for the communities that you may fund or where you work. And when you're making space for conversation, know that this is a time that there are people who are living what others may only be reading about or hearing about in the media. So have room for kindness and space and comfort and emotion in your agendas. And Yami touched on this. There's nobody better than Travion Shorters. You can get his work here through the network. Focus on brilliance and assets as well when you're defining Black folks and all folks, and you pass the mic to tell that story. I touched on this earlier, the same zip codes where we're seeing people dying, where people died, 700 people in 1 week 25 years ago because of a heat wave. We're seeing it with the pandemic and climate change. It tells us where we need to focus our work, right? There's no secret about that. White folks, teach your children about race and power and history. This is your responsibility. And please move the burden away from us always having to explain everything, and from the colleagues living that Black experience. Read your books, talk amongst yourselves. And to the next and final slide for me, my very last thoughts. Can you advance the slides, T? Monitor and protect our free press. Yes, like Sean, I'm a former journalist. We always have it in us, but you can choose fact-based journalism that meets the criteria of our founding people to help people make informed, sound decisions. And you can choose that, over media that sensationalize events. And a tiny digression, we in Chicago heard about Kanye running for president, and my phone blew up with all my friends. I'm 63, my age and older, like, what's happening? He's blah, blah, blah. And all of my young friends saying, you know, it's not gonna last. There's a lot of issues going on there. And that's an example of how the generations have to come together and how the media you use and follow matters even in this moment, which leads into keeping our eyes on the political prize. Let's not be divided and distracted when a national referendum on the current president is just months away. And ask yourself how you can listen and help those who want peace and justice. We are who we have been waiting for. We can co-create the world that we want. And I just leave you again with the words from the St. Croix Foundation from Deanna James. Read it to yourself, but just lean into light and courage, kindness and strength, honesty, and being comfortable with discomfort. And with that, thank you. We'll turn it back over to Sean and maybe have some time for questions.
We do indeed have a little time for questions. And first, just thanks to everybody, Sylvia, Jamira, Yami, and Ann. This has been extraordinary. For those of you who may need to leave us just up at the top of the hour, we are recording this as we always do. And so we'll have this up on the network's YouTube channel. Give us a couple hours, maybe tomorrow, but suffice to say, let's jump into the questions. We have a number of them. The first one, and I'll leave it to y'all to decide who wants to take this on, is how can we encourage our organization's leadership to listen to our served communities and outline our action steps and strategies before creating an equity and inclusion statement, rather than rushing to put together a statement for PR purposes first and then letting the action follow?
Well, I'm just going to say, I told you about the Poetry Foundation. That's all I'm going to say. And then others can jump in on that. If you can't do it out of wisdom, you do it from a cautionary tale.
Just to add to that, I think it's important to know and understand the leader's language and really approach the leader where they understand best. So most leaders understand the bottom line, help them, connect back to why this is important, and then have a strategy for how you're gonna, navigate that. But at the very least, of course, you need to get their attention and understanding, what connects them to this work most. And even not so much so the work, but the sustainability of the organization. Understanding what connects them to the sustainability first and have that strategy mapped out to connect back to whatever that thing is that captures their attention.
Okay, next question, also a lot of heat on this one, comes from our friend Albert. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, Albert Garcia. He says, what advice or thoughts do you have, especially for communicators who work in organizations that have white EDs or CEOs, or are considered part of white-led organizations? How do we balance the need for our organizations to yield or share space in the moment and the sector's need to see or hear more voices of color, especially our own power Black staff and communicators?
I'm just going to ask Ann, can you unmute and share your Jackson quote and how you do this? Because we need more Ann Evans, but.
Yeah, I think as leaders, we have to remember that it's up to us to lead the entire organization and invite the conversation. I think your question is fantastic, and you should be asking your own leader that question and be having the conversation. I always see the assets of our organization and the brilliance of our team. And so I have always felt that it is important to have multiple communicators. Communicating elevates message, because that demonstrates and creates visibility into the just huge assets that the organization has in our team, in our people. And so, yeah, I think that's one model, but I invite you to have the conversation.
If I could chime in too really quickly, I work closely with both Sylvia and Ann at Elevate, and Ann has been tremendous about checking in with us internally. So in the same way that you're collecting stories and listening to your external community, is equally as important to do that within your organizations in talking to and forging these conversations with your staff, it not only creates a stronger culture, right, for your organization, but it also means that you can meet the needs of your community better. As Anne is pursuing funding opportunities or thinking through how to approach new programming or new opportunities, she checks in with us. She checks in with my team to find out what are the needs for the people on the ground. And closing that loop is so important to informing how we move forward.
Other thoughts, or should we move ahead? Jamira?
Okay.
That's
Okay. Our friend Keith asks, any suggestions for managing how we really want to push the envelope, getting out of your lane, and doing so without seeming inauthentic? How do organizations and people avoid the shut up and play basketball response? I think that's a Fox News thing.
I'm going to go with the listening angle. And one of the things that has been on my mind, it's very easy to pick sides, but it's harder to bring people together. So really listen, truly listen, see where you first can add value. And if in your listening you have discovered new needs, that is where you pivot without apology, but with generosity.
And just to add to that, I think it's important as leaders and even as teammates, it's important to first sit with your own thoughts and ideas around the issue and really, identify where you can be genuine in your response or connecting to, whomever else you're having these conversations with. I think at this moment in time, certainly being disingenuous about where you stand when it comes to different issues is so evident and it's so much more easier to see. And I don't know if social media made it just that much more transparent, but there is a way of welcoming that transparency that does not isolate a particular audience or group. And I think it first starts with self and really identifying your own emotions around this. If you're confused, if you're angry, if you're frustrated, I personally, when learning about George Floyd, there was so much rage in me that knowing myself, if I did not channel this properly, I could really destroy some things. And so, just in identifying how am I going to direct this rage that I feel. Mm-hmm. And so, just in being able to communicate with yourself and really have, a clear sense of where your emotions lie and how you can direct those. You don't want to leave it trapped, but you also don't want to burn bridges or, burn opportunity to really help right some wrongs.
And Sean, I just want to add one more thing to that questioner, going back to our slides. This is an opportunity to build partnerships. Who is in that space that knows you, that you trust, who can guide you? Where can you make new liaisons? You heard Yami and Jamira and Ann, all of us use the word leverage. So it's an opportunity to build connection with people who can be your guide.
And I think that we all are learning that is so essential for us right now is growing and learning together. I think that's a theme of 2020. Allison asked a question. I'm wondering how to center the experience of Black and Indigenous people of color staff in messaging without making it feel like a burden or extra work for those folks.
Don't make it extra work.
Yeah, don't do it. Don't have Black, Indigenous people of color read, don't do like make everyone read this because you need to read it. Do your homework, talk amongst ourselves, do the work, and yeah, just don't do it. And ask people how they're doing, ask people how they're feeling. I almost start every single meeting saying, please make no assumptions. You do not know what people's lived experience is today. You didn't know it yesterday pre-COVID, but you definitely don't know it today. And pre the senseless killing of George Floyd and so many others, you don't know what people's experiences are. So please make no assumptions. Take your time, ask, do your homework.
Yami, talk about your consultant. You're about to do it, never mind. We know each other so well. about bringing other people in to help too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This is not something we can do alone. It requires all of our active and intentional engagement and willingness to work together. I think that's another reminder that's come to the surface in light of, you know, the national conversation around public health as well as racial injustice and inequality, right? This
And
is not,
Jamira too,
not
I'm
a
looking at
one-person
you.
job.
Yeah, I'm over here like, you know, there are so many people who have longed for being able to have these open conversations. And, you know, as we continue, at Public Narrative, continue to partner with other organizations, and I learn about the individual, not necessarily the organization, and really tap into their lived experiences. There are so many people who are circle keepers and different counselors and have this expertise that allows them to be, you know, that Black or Indigenous person of color, but also allows them to be that that mediator. And so, you know, there are some folks who literally, we've been preparing for this, and I would go so far as to say that the nonprofits, you all have been preparing for this as well. It seems as though everything we were doing pre-COVID was just kind of like practice and getting ready for when it's time to actually get in the game. And so I think it's important to, as leaders, to make certain that we trust our intuition, that we don't navigate in fear, and that we're very conscious of how powerful our words are and how and where they might land and what that might mean for someone who's influenced by them.
Yeah.
I think it's my job to keep track of the clock, and so we are now at 7 minutes past the hour. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, we do need to leave it there. So my huge thanks. Thank you, Jamira. I think that's a good place to close. That said, I know, folks, we had a number of questions we didn't get a chance to get to. So would it be okay if folks reach out to y'all either over the listserv or through Twitter or any number of other means? Or I know the Public Narrative website is easily available, as is Elevate. Are you all okay with taking a few questions from folks after hours?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, everyone. A wonderful way to spend part of our day.
Yeah, thanks to all of you, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Be safe and well. You'll be hearing from us soon about the circles I spoke about at the outset, and inviting you to a webinar with our friends from the Atlantic early next week to talk about some of the survey results we saw from talking to all of you over the last couple of months, learning how all of our practices have changed. Thanks very much for everybody. Be well, be safe, and we'll talk to you again very, very soon. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye, guys.